Hi, this is Chris Hoy. Thank you for joining me on Create with Chris. Today I will be showing you how to easily paint this vintage cinnamon stick candle ornament with some unusual but simple tips, tricks, and techniques. So whether you are a beginner or painting for fun, grab your brushes and let's get started. I recently designed and painted this set of ornaments. I love the nostalgic flair and I wanted to share the complete set with you. The lesson today is for the cinnamon stick candle ornament. I listed the link below if you're interested in instructions for all three. The surface is MDF, which is a wood-based product. For that reason, I do seal it with a multi-purpose sealer. Just give it a quick coat, smooth it out nice and even, let it dry, and give it a quick sand. That will make a smoother surface, the paint will adhere better, and it'll be easier on the brushes. A little bit of bleach sand, I'm using a number 10 filbert just to kind of slap it on. I don't want a smooth background, more like a texture of a plaster background. So I put the bleach sand in the middle, bringing in portobello mostly from the outer edge toward the center and blending it together. Picked up a little bit of lush green. That's going to add a little bit of color and also more interest in the background, maybe look like distant greenery or foliage. And again, it's just very loose and more painted, texture of a plaster, more so than a nice smooth even finish. So this is very free, very loose. There's no right or wrong way. You just want to get a multitude of colors on there that kind of transitions one to the other. I've picked up a little bit of charcoal gray on the bottom of my palette, just a hint of color, and I'm very lightly pulling it across the flat of the palette, across the ornament. Leaves a wonderful texture, very interesting, super easy to do, but wow, the results are just amazing. I don't want it to get too dark, so I'm picking up a little bit of bleach sand to brighten that up. If you're not a fan of this, just kind of skip over this step. I love the added texture and I think it gives it a different look. Now I'm using my Radical Round and cinnamon stick to just pull down the shape of those cinnamon sticks that are wrapped around the candle, adding a little bit of bleached sand at the top. And I'm not being particularly fussy, I just want to get the colors in here. Shading down the sides of the cinnamon sticks with a little bit of burnt umber, pulling in some of that portobello at the base of the wax. And this is going to give a lot of dimension. Don't want that wax to become dark, so I am going to brighten that back up with a little bit of bleached sand. Adding some more burnt umber to divide those cinnamon sticks up. One thing about cinnamon sticks, they're all different sizes. They don't have to be straight, and it really gives them a unique look. Using that same technique and cocoa to pull down a little bit of highlight and texture on the cinnamon sticks. Be careful, if you get too much paint, you're going to get a splotch instead of a nice texture. Not a big deal. You can always go back and touch it up, but that's just one extra step that you don't want to have to worry about if you keep that paint very light. A little bit of paint makes such a big difference. Bringing in some bleach sand, doing that same technique, just want to brighten those cinnamon sticks up. And I like to jump around when I paint because I think it brings more continuity if you work the whole composition, build it up together as opposed to painting the wax by itself and the sticks by themselves, and they just seem to fit in a little bit better. Just adding a little more detail, some highlights on the top of those sticks, pulling some highlights down the sticks. Want to add that candle glow, and I'm using a round stencil. I've loaded my Spectacular stencil brush with a little bit of bleach sand, and I'm just going to very lightly dry brush. I wipe my brush off well before I do this. Just that hint of a halo in the back. It doesn't need to be solid nor heavy, just the location, and I did bring it down just a little bit be on the top of the candle. I didn't have it way above. Now we are going to put in the candle flame. I'm using my number 5 radical round. I love candle flames because they're all different. So you just basically do a messy teardrop, pull it out to a point, charcoal gray wick, and I did use banana cream on that. I wanted to create a well or a kind of a divot in the top of the candle, so I just darkened below where the wick is and added some more highlights. Scooped a little bit of Santa Red around the base of the candle, and now I'm just going to go in with the toe of my angle and tap in some highlights. It's just that simple. Very, very quick and easy. In fact, I think it looks better if you don't spend a lot of time on it. Sharpen the outer edge of that halo with a little bit of Snow White, just a hint of color. It doesn't take much, and I'll say this often, a little bit of paint makes a big difference. To do the pine branches, I'm just using charcoal gray, and I am just basically roughing in where the branches are going to go. I've already lined in where the pine cones are, so I know I want to snuggle the pine branches in and around all of the pine cones. Just took my palette knife and spread on a little bit of that bleached sand in the foreground to brighten that up. Very loose, not fussy at all, not being particular about placement or exact. I kind of like that look. Using plantation pine just to stroke in some more pine needles. And you notice I don't fill it up solid and heavy. Some of these pine needles are going to be in front of the pine cones, some of them are behind. So I kind of have to jump back and forth as I go along. Adding some blush green, that's the color it was used in the background. By the time all these layers of color are added on there, that pine branch is going to become nice and full, and it's going to work out really, really well. I am using my filbert to create the pine cones. I'm just stroking it in and kind of using the side edge to create an uneven where those little scales are going to kind of jag out from the pine cone. Stay on this is burnt umber. I'm start with a real dark base. These are so simple. Don't make it more difficult than they need to be. Once they're in there, I'm just taking the toe of my brush. This is cocoa, and I'm just touching. When you touch, you create that little kind of a half moon stroke. So it's not anything that has to be exactly painted. I wanted to turn it upside down. It changes the direction of that little half moon if you turn it upside down. So you can decide which way the pine cone lays, which way the little half moon scale needs to be positioned. I just think that turned out so nice. And now I'm going to go back with a little bit of bleached sand and highlight the scales, mostly the ones that are facing the direction of the candle glow. That's where the brightest part is going to be positioned to pick up that extra light. This is such a light touch, and I will go back later on and add more or brighten as needed. So this is not the final application of the highlights. And I'm just loading the toe of my 1/2 inch angle with charcoal gray, very, very thin. I want to create that look of shadowing below all the pine cones and a little bit around the edge at the top, just to helps to balance it out. I didn't bring it over the candle halo. I just want that to build that depth up at the same time. It just creates a nice balance, and it's really hard to go back after everything's painted and add those shadows in. Using celery shoot, I've thinned it down with my Epic script liner. If you're not getting a super fine thin line, you don't have enough moisture in your brush, Add a little bit more water and it just should roll right off of the brush. Pay attention when you're adding the highlights in regards to that candle glow so that it reflects appropriately or accordingly. So if you want the tips to stand out, that's where you need to add the highlights. Now I'm starting to add the pine needles in and around the pine cones in the foreground. After the pine cones are created, it makes it so much easier to put those in. And adding a little bit of shading with that charcoal gray, that's kind of our connecting thread throughout to divide the pine cones and the pine branches. Going back again with this bleach sand to brighten those highlights up, and you'll be able to tell if they're too quiet, if they're not the right shape. Touch them up a little bit, but basically pine cones are so simple to create. And I'm using my Epic script liner just to go back with a little bit of Snow White to touch up, to brighten, to add just a little more impact in those areas. Celery shoot to brighten up those pine needles. Look how they jump out with just that little bit of highlight. I've already added plantation pine and lush green, so it doesn't take much to really fill those in. And with those dark shadows behind it, it just becomes super quick and easy, and I think it just looks great. Brighten up that highlight in the candle. I do jump around, kind of keep an eye to make sure that all the bright highlights kind of balance each other out. I'm using my painter's palette to stencil the berries bleach sand. With having a brighter background on the berries, the red is going to really glow and be much more of a festive Christmas red. When using a stencil and stencil brush, be sure to wipe the brush over a paper towel before applying the paint. That will ensure crisp, clean edges and you won't get any paint running under. Using the toe of my 1/4 inch awesome angle to brighten the top of the berries facing the flame with orange flame. And then I will deepen the opposite side with a little bit of cranberry wine. Just a nice transition from bright to dark. Just a little bit of paint makes a big difference. Make sure that the direction of the light faces the flame and smooth that paint in there pretty well. It doesn't have to be perfect. We have a lot going on here, just don't want it to get messy. Using the same brush and a little bit of charcoal gray to separate between the pine cones, around the candle, below the berries, just giving a little more shading and darkness in that area. Using the toe of my 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch awesome angle to float a little bit of thinned bleach sand or Snow White on the tops of the berries to brighten them up. Going back now with some celery shoot to brighten up and add a few more little tufts of pine needles. Just really helps to sprinkle them in there, and especially in front of the pine cones where there weren't many. It just fills that area in, adds a lot more detail, makes it look a little more delicate. And you can see what a difference just that little bit of paint makes. Going back with my Epic script liner and Snow White to brighten up and add those comma strokes. Really bring that strong highlight in there. Make those berries really pop. And just keep the intensity of the brightness pretty much the same. So I'm going back now to brighten up the candle so that it all looks similar. Using bleach sand and my Epic script liner to paint the baker's twine around the candle and the little bow. Again, if your paint's not flowing on smoothly, pick up a little more water in your brush to thin it down. A couple coats of paint really makes it nice coverage. Going back with Snow White, mostly on the top edge to brighten it up and make sure it's just based in there pretty nice. Have charcoal gray on the toe of my radical round number 2, putting a little shadow below and where the bow kind of overlaps each other. I'm going to go back and add more shading, but this helps break it up and divide which parts of the baker's twine are in front of the others. I'm just doing like a little diagonal stroke of Santa red on the bow to make it look like the baker's twine. Kind of keep that little curve on there. Decide which loop's in front of which loop, and I'm not being very particular, just kind of eyeing the spacing out. It just really helps to dress it up and adds a little bit of whimsy to that ribbon. Add a little more red in the candle flame. I told you I jumped around a lot. A little bit of red here and there in the shading. Some of that from the berries will reflect onto the surface. Just a little teeny highlight. A little bit of paint makes a big difference. This is my favorite part, just kind of going back and touching up. I think the secret to making it look good is separating everything out and creating depth. And adding little touches of layers of paint is huge. I did the shading before. Now that we've got everything in there, I can go back and really divide that up. Very, very thin charcoal gray. It's just a beautiful shading color. And look how that bow just kind of becomes 3D just with that little bit of shading. What a difference that makes. I was going to take this out, but I decided to leave it in. I thought this pine cone on the left was a little bit weirdly shaped, so I just went back and reshaped it. I added a couple more scales there on the left side. I just thought it looked a little lopsided, so very easy to touch those up. Adding a little bit of a hint of banana cream on the edge of the halo, there on the top of the wax. Splash a little bit of yellow here and there on the foreground. This is another of my favorite parts, aqua sky. Pulling that blue into the shading areas. Look what a difference this makes. I think this is just amazing. I love doing this. I love seeing the transition from just plain colors to really ramping it up. A little bit on the shading on the bottom side of the baker's twine. I love how that really just pulls that nice, cool, deep shadow tone in there. A little bit here and there on the cinnamon stick. Don't overdo. A little bit, and it's mostly in the shaded areas. You can see if I get it too heavy, I wipe it down. I use my finger, but some here and there on the pine cones, on the back side of the berries. It just takes those berries from a painted red berry to, they almost look kind of translucent. That just really adds a whole another level to it. Using a splatter brush to add the splattering. I didn't have my camera on, but I splattered it mostly on the background. I tried not to get so much on the candle in the foreground. And then again, I forgot to turn my camera on, but I took that aqua blue and I wanted to pull that all together. So I used my 1/2 inch angle to shade around the outer edge and then kind of hit some of those shaded areas in around the foreground. I love how all these little touches and little bits of paint work together to create such a beautiful finished piece. I did varnish everything with ultra matte varnish. I like the matte finish. I think it works perfectly with this design. I did speed up the video and took out the dry time, but in real time, I believe it took about 1.5 hours to paint, so it went very quickly. I love how it turned out, and I hope you give it a try. Let me know if you have any questions or comments. I would love to hear from you. Everything I used will be listed in the links below. If you like what you see, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. That way you won't miss out on upcoming videos. Be sure to check out my other videos, and thank you again for joining me today, and I look forward to our next painting adventure together. Please remember, a little bit of paint makes a big difference.